of these. We're going to have a little bit of an educational process here with the Finance 101. This is something that we dusted off from years before and updated. And then we have some revenue projections we're going to work through a little bit, and that's pretty timely with the budget process ahead of us. So the Revenue 101, we're going to talk about some sources of income. First thing we want to talk about is different types of funds. We've heard a lot of discussion with things. Probably the most common fund that we hear of is the general fund, and that is the largest and the most common fund we have. It is considered to be a governmental fund, and it differentiates from other types of funds. Included in the governmental funds is our capital projects, special revenue, debt service funds, as well as the general fund. So all of those combined are considered to be governmental funds. And what's special about these types of funds is when funding goes into those, each specific fund, if it isn't expended at the end of the year, the money generally stays in that fund. It isn't used for any other purpose. And that also applies to other funds like the enterprise funds that we'll talk about here in a minute. The biggest of the general fund includes things like general government, public safety, and streets. So enterprise funds are things that the city operates like a business. So including water, sewer, storm sewer, sanitation, cemetery, parking authority, airport, and also the parking ramps. So another thing that differentiates these is we use a different type of accounting method, excuse me, for enterprise funds versus governmental funds. So the way we account for things in the governmental funds is on a modified accrual basis. Enterprise funds use full accrual accounting just like a normal business would. All right, this just explains some of the sources of revenues for governmental funds and enterprise funds. So governmental funds are primarily property taxes, state aid, sales tax, fees that we charge for services, licenses and permits, grants, fines, and of course interest earnings. Uses of those types of funds: public safety, library, assessor's office, human resources, finance, IT, other administrative departments, traffic and street, community development and engineering, property maintenance. Of course, city manager, city council's expenses come out of there, and city infrastructure and capital purchases. Enterprise funds, the revenues generally come from user fees, airport revenue, sanitation, cemetery fees, special assessments, interest earnings. Uses, again, personnel, providing the services that we're charging a fee for, infrastructure, maintenance of the infrastructure, and doing the billing for those services as well. So this graphic shows some of the differences. So looking at governmental activities, the bulk of governmental activities are funded by taxes of one type or another. So that includes property taxes, sales taxes, revenues from the state that are derived from sales taxes. And when you contrast that to the enterprise funds on the right, the main source of funding for the enterprise funds is charges for services and then operating and capital grants. So this is a chart that we've updated recently, just showing the property tax rate and the collections, and this will become important as we work through the revenue estimates leading up to this budget. And the reason I wanted to show this graphic here is, you know, it looks like when you look at the rate, we've been fairly level or actually declined a little bit on the rate. And the amount that we've collected has gone up just slightly because this is collected tax dollars, not levied tax dollars. And that's an important distinction right now because in the last few years, we've held the levy somewhat flat and the amount that was levied has increased based on the increased assessment. And some of that is from increases in values and new construction has come on board. What we've also seen in the last several years is our amount of delinquencies has gone up as well. So even though that rate was flat and we anticipated collecting more in property tax dollars each year. The delinquencies have gone up, so that's really kept that somewhat flat across the board in what we've actually received. Sales tax. Now, this is a little bit of a dated graphic, but I wanted to point this out just to clarify some things that we heard in the last few weeks, some of the presentations we've had, and some of the discussion surrounding NAS in the sales tax pennies. So before we reallocated any money to NAS, this is what the allocations look like before NAS came on board. So the first penny and the second penny allocations. And of course, NAS is in the second penny allocation. So when we add that 40% for NAS, the other three allocations were reduced proportionately. So instead of infrastructure receiving 40% of a penny, it's now only receiving 60% of that, so it's 24. And of course, property tax relief and flood control were also released to 18%. So some of the discussion that we've heard recently is what happens when the NAS funding goes away? Well, it goes right back to the way it was before. That 40% that's allocated to NAS does not go to any other thing. The allocations just go back to their full amount as they are in the sales tax ordinance. So I just wanted to make sure that that is clear. It looks like we have several years of funding yet to allocate towards NAS, so it's probably going to be 26 or 27 before we're able to get rid of that. But when we do, it will go back to the same allocation as it was before. So sales tax collections, this is something that you've all seen before. The bold red line there is this year's sales tax collections. January was the best month we've seen in the history of sales tax in the city, followed by two not so stellar months worth of collections. And when we started looking at the guidance we're given from the state and from the League of Cities on next year's revenue projections for sales tax, they're forecasting that we should be down 3.5% from the 2023 actual numbers. So we start looking at that. 2023 was a pretty good year in collections for us. So we're looking for some validation to that forecast here in these numbers. And this does not give us a warm, fuzzy feeling on keeping a level number. So we got new numbers in today for the month of April, and here's where we're at. So that helps us out a little bit. It's a very good month for April. And again, well above the 5-year average. Year to date, we're up about 17% year over year. So that looks good, but again, very volatile. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. And I'm going to throw out a projection here in a little bit, but that's something that'll be a little bit fluid as we move through the budget process. This is just another graphic of sales tax collections that I've shown in some slides. When you look at this, it looks like as we move to the right in the graph, it's almost a steady increase, and it shows that sales tax continue to increase, and we shouldn't be worried about anything. We go to the next slide. If we go back a few more years, this is what the sales tax collections look like. Back in 14 and 15 were very strong. Actually, in 2014 was about the same amount as it was last year. And all of a sudden in 16, we had a sudden decline in sales tax that lasted for several years. So this is where a little bit of the, being a little nervous about throwing out an aggressive projection comes from here. Hub City Oil and Gas Funds. This is just the chart from the last few years. We looked at the director's cut from the Department of Mineral Resources, and they're projecting that production is going to stay fairly steady at about 1.1 million barrels per day. Prices have remained strong, so we're basing our production on historical numbers here, and we'll hope for the best in the upcoming year. So right now, what we're looking at based on the state's guidance and what we're seeing for actuals, we're anticipating that we'll use a budget number of about $12.25 million per penny for sales tax revenues and $6.25 million for Hub City revenues. So this is one of the first steps in our revenue projections to develop the budget, but it's a pretty critical step for us moving forward too. All right, this is just just a couple of slides from the CIP for the next 4 years. And these are some big numbers. The CIP, the total was just under $613 million in the top slide based on the different departments. The bottom slide there shows the different funding, and where that's important is if you add up all those local funding sources, it's right at about $242 million over the next 5 years for local funding on these CIP projects. Now, I'll caveat this a little bit that the water sewer has, or sanitary sewer has a big number in there for a potential need for a sewage treatment plant at some point in the future. With the permitting process that we're under right now, it looks like that may be pushed off further into the future. But another caveat here is the CIP does not include any of the funding remaining for NAWS or anything to do with the police department or the rehab of the old City Hall building. So there are some other costs that will come into play here, as well as what's already in the CIP. So this is just a quick exercise that we go through when we look at reserves, and we try to take our ending balance from the prior year, look at what's committed or encumbered, take our reserves, our bond covenants, and then also what is projected to be used in the current budget, and we look forward and try and project a cash balance. So if you look at the very bottom corner, and I know it's pretty small, it looks like a pretty big number. There it's about $98 million. And the problem is we just said we have about $142 million of unfunded local share for CIP in the next 5 years as well. Okay, this is just a quick slide to show some additional sources of information. A lot of these reports are published on the finance webpage. So if you go to the finance webpage, which is the top link there, all of these items have a link here. You can look at all the budgets, the annual reports, Magic Fund reports, monthly reports, quarterly, and then year-end cash balances as well. That's all I have. I'll stand for any questions.
Are there any questions for finance? Steve?
Yeah, that was very informative, but I just didn't quite catch the state projection. What period of time and what 3% down? Could you clarify that again?
Mr. Mayor, Alderman Padragula, what the state is doing is they're saying based on 2023 actual numbers, they are projecting that the 2025 revenues for sales tax will be 3.5% less than 2023 actual numbers.
Thank you. And that's for the calendar year.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Dave? Seeing none, thank you, Dave.